Well, I add my welcome to those who are here, those who are online. Welcome. I want to I want to really invite us into opening ourselves to a certain truth, a truth that I think you'll find your soul wants to hear, needs to hear, but needs to even live into, and that is this: that we are never home apart from the love of God. We're never truly home in our existence apart from the love of God. We were created to live in relationship to God. We're not merely the sum part of our biological nature. You are not merely chemistry. You are, as the scriptures tell us, a living soul. You are a living soul. And the scriptures tell us that we were created and endowed with an element of God's very nature because we were created to live in relationship to that nature. And when we look at a child, an infant, a newborn, I would imagine that we might see that there is a biological need, but I would say that even greater, we look and we say that this is one who needs, at its very core, to be loved and to love. And the truth is, that is who we are, and we continue to be. We continue to be creatures who were created and will never function fully and truly human until we know what it is to be loved and to love. And so it is that Jesus, when he speaks about how we're to live our lives, he said of all of it, if you were to sum it up, if you were to align everything within us, it would be this. The greatest of the commands is this. The most important one is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. That is what is meant to be truly our first love. And it may sound, in light of all things, that that's just obvious. And in many ways, it is obvious. And yet, if we're honest, it's also perhaps the most challenging of all. Perhaps many of us kind of recall a moment, I know I do, where I can think back to when I first really grasped and heard of God's love for me, a love that would come for me, a love that would die for me, a love that would seek me. Something in my deepest nature, my spirit, it leapt towards that. And it was a sense of, this is the most important thing for me to know. And I think and step back and realize, but that is so easy to drift from the grip of that, to lose a sense of that. And maybe you're one who finds that first love, that sense of really realizing this has got my full attention, is lost. And it can be like any earthly love, it can wane with familiarity. You know, I was saying to my wife last night, how many times uh, but any of us really could, have been told or said that God died for us. And when you say it and you hear it so many times, perhaps it loses the grip on us, just out of familiarity. But also, we can find that our sense of deep desire for God kind of gets overturned and lost and overtaken by mere duty, where we feel like, well, I'm staying obligated, but it just doesn't have the power. Doesn't really have our hearts in the same way. Or perhaps we just find that our affections have connected to other things. And so there's a competing in our hearts for really what we long for, what we give ourselves to, because of the other claims on our affections. In all these ways, we're taking this season to focus on restoring that first love, of how we can live in and form that kind of love within us. And we're doing so during what is known as the Lenten season, as Ron just referred to. And Lent, as you may know, is that final 40 days before we come to the remembrance of Christ's death on the cross, his crucifixion, which we celebrate on Good Friday, and then his resurrection on Easter. And as Pope Francis said, Lent comes providentially to awaken us, to shake us from our lethargy, to kind of give us that sense of coming back and focusing on this. And now I know Lent is often associated as a season within the Catholic tradition, but the truth is that many have celebrated it throughout Orthodox and Protestant traditions as well. For it is at its core something that arose very early in the life of the church as they recognized a need to want to prepare themselves. And looking back to the 40 days in which Christ went into the wilderness and fasted and prayed in preparation for the life and the sacrifice that he would bring, it's an invitation for us to prepare ourselves in the same way, to look at his own passion, his own sacrifice, and to prepare ourselves and to face our temptations and to, in a sense, root ourselves again in that which centers us and calls us. And as such, the Lenten season has taken on various forms of fasting, following the way of Jesus. And that can be fasting, as many choose, from food most commonly, and it might be from a certain meal every day or a day of the week. One fasts, many fasting on Friday or a portion thereof. Very common for people to fast on Fridays until at least the dinner hour. But it also can be something that God may lead us to in terms of an activity. Perhaps it's something that we realize, this has kind of got my attention a lot. And it's probably not bringing out the best of my own sense of focus. And so maybe we detach from something in order to give ourselves and attach more to the heart of God. And so we invite all of us to think of what it is that maybe we detach from, something that we maybe set aside in order to connect with that deeper hunger that we need during this season. Now, in the Catholic tradition, it's most common to follow, Lent really began this last Wednesday on what is known as Ash Wednesday. And it continues for 40 days by excluding Sundays, given those as the days of celebration. And we've chosen to slightly shift that a bit for ourselves over the years because we found it's wonderful to begin partly on a Monday so that we're gathered here before that starts. So today is kind of a day to put our minds into the reality of this season and what it could mean for us and to have our sense of awareness about it. And as we go into the coming week, so we simply begin tomorrow, and it's 40 days without excluding Sundays, but it continues until Good Friday, which will come soon enough. But in the meanwhile, it is that focus. And so today, our invitation is to join this season. And we begin in the spirit of Ash Wednesday. The ashes were a symbol of one bowing themselves to the ground and, in a sense, putting our head to the dirt, to the ground in humility. It's that spirit of humility and hunger for God out of which we begin. When Jesus spoke one of the greatest messages of what life is about and how we should live, it's known as the Sermon on the Mount. And so many have said that this is above and beyond anything that any human has ever brought into the world of human understanding and ethics and what it means really to live rightly as humans. Everything from the Dalai Lama to Mahatma Gandhi have said there's nothing like this. And how does it begin? What are the very first words by which Jesus says? He says this, and we read in the Gospel of Matthew, he says, "How blessed are those who are poor in spirit, for they will inherit the kingdom of God." Or rightfully and well translated as well, one could say, how blessed are those who know their need of God. How blessed are those who know their need of God. For the kingdom of heaven is theirs. So I want to bring us and invite us into the reality that our love for God begins with our need. our need for God. And that is where it challenges us because it is hard for us to kind of admit a need. We are those who are proclaiming in ourselves that we're independent beings who are self sufficient. And there is this natural pride, we're told, at the very root of our problem that we try to live beyond who we really are. We're trying to play a role that is not ours. We are finite creatures who live before the infinite, and that God is profoundly distinct from us. So we have to kind of begin with the fact that we must come to terms with our need. As C.S. Lewis once wrote, he said, as long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. It challenges the very posture of our heart because I think when we, especially as Western lives, when we try to come around God, when we try to engage God, we tend to see ourselves as the subjects and we speak of God as if He's the object that we can merely contain and control with our words, with our ideas, and how off we are. I am not the subject and He is not the object. It's the other way around. I am what He speaks of me. I didn't create myself. I stand as the one to be understood in light of Him. I fundamentally come with that need. And we similarly face that He is immeasurably superior to us in any sense of goodness, of how we think of ourselves as good. I have to stand before Him, not the other way around. We all long for goodness. We all have a sense of goodness. We all believe that there's justice out there. It's why we fight for it. There's beauty out there. That's why we try to claim the beauty and look into the beauty, because there is something greater that we have never fully grasped in this condition. And so we're always looking for something that is greater, and we need to see that it is that which we come before. Our need is for that which is greater than us in every level, and that is our longing to be connected to. That is how we rightfully come with our need. And so we come to one encounter in which this becomes so clear when we see how Jesus in this encounter engaged two particular lives. I invite you to follow with me. And we find this in the Gospel of Luke chapter 7, where Luke is giving the account of what took place. And you can follow with me on the screen or on your device or in a Bible. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. Now you can imagine they didn't recline at a table that was upright, but at a low table in which they would have leaned on the table and their feet would have been spread out behind them into the outer space. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher. Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water from my feet, but she wet my hair with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from this time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Then Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. The other guests They began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" And Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Here we have a religious leader, Simon. He's a part of the religious elite as a Pharisee, and he is going to throw a dinner party. And this dinner party, as it would be held then, would probably be held in an outer courtyard of his home. And these kinds of parties were, in a sense, public events. There were certain guests who could come, but everybody that was mingling about in the community would be free to kind of come through it. They were not guests, but they were not intruders. And so, in the midst of this, as he's throwing this party of which Jesus is considered to have been the special guest, he invites this rabbi who all the people are beginning to follow to come and be that guest. Now, we know that the Pharisees, these religious elite, were threatened by Jesus. And we might wonder, well, why would he throw this party? The most likelihood is that he was looking a way to catch Jesus. It's been said, you bring your friends close, but your enemies closer. Like, stay close to them if you're trying to catch them in something. And that seems to have been the way of these leaders. And so he invites them to this party, but really his interest in Jesus is probably more to catch him. And so in comes this woman who makes her way in, which was not in some way entirely strange, but she finds her way to the outside of the table and there to Jesus, where she begins to show her love for him in this extravagant way, this emotional way. And after a bit of that, you get to a point in which Simon sees this, and perhaps he sees kind of a moment where he says, "Oh, I can see that if he is deemed to be one who is now representing God, he couldn't possibly represent him because, look, the way that he is allowing this woman to come and to care for him, to touch him, he can't possibly be one who's really a prophet because he doesn't seem to realize who she is. She is a sinner." And it's to this that Jesus explains, and he uses a very simple analogy of two people who owe money, but neither can pay their debt. He says one owns 500 denarii and another 50. And a denarii was a day's wage. So if you simply were to kind of apply that to the math and how that is really reflected in what was owed, one owed about 2 months' wages. That's a lot. But the other owed about 2 years' wages. That is almost beyond anything anybody could ever hope to be free from. And he says this, which one of them could pay their debt? Who? Which one? Neither. Neither could pay the debt, he says. Neither of them had the money to pay him back. So he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, and you can almost hear this reluctance in the tone by which he answers. I suppose, he says, the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly. Always. And we tend to lighten that. We tend not to think of it that way. We tend to think it just means something got kind of just pushed aside, but that is not the truth. The reality is somebody pays that debt. Either the debtor pays it or who? The giver, the one to whom they gave the money up front. That person ends up paying that debt. And so there is always a cost. The one who's forgiven most, the one who's fully aware of, oh my, there's a great cost that is being taken on by the other. That is the one, Jesus says, who loves much. And this is what he brings forward to him. Jesus draws this out by helping to paint the picture of what's taking place right there in this scene. For there he points out that Simon and this woman had related to Jesus so differently on that evening. The very things that one would do to show regard for another, to show their care and lifting one to who they are to them, Simon had completely neglected. And many believe that he neglected even the most basic regard for a guest as almost a statement towards Jesus. For anybody that would come as a guest, let alone a special guest, would have been welcomed into the home with certain things that were completely neglected by Simon, but so powerfully expressed by this woman. And so he says, when I came in, you didn't even provide water from my feet, because the first thing a guest would do when they would come to a home, they all wore sandals, their feet were filthy and dirty. You'd come into a home and there would be a basin of water. Sometimes they would even wash their feet, or usually at least a servant would have been there to wash the feet to welcome the guest in. He says, you didn't even provide water for my feet. But look at her. She has not stopped wiping my feet with her tears. She's so moved, and you seem to have no sense of what's at hand, of the depth of forgiveness by which you would love much. And then he goes on to say, and that you did not even greet me with a kiss, the standard way of greeting. We shake hands, we give a hug when we welcome someone in. Hey, I'm welcoming you. I'm reaching out to you. I'm extending myself. And they would give a kiss on the cheek. And he's saying, you never even gave me a kiss on the cheek. She has not stopped kissing my feet. The greatest act of humility of one who couldn't care what anyone else thinks or their own dignity. And there she is kissing his feet. And then he marks the last where he says, and you did not anoint my head with oil. For it was common when one came and they lived in a place of great exposure and their scalps were always dry. And so you blessed them by just putting a bit of oil upon their hair, upon their scalp. And he says, you didn't give me oil, but she has been pouring her own perfume, this extravagant, valuable, something that gave her dignity. She has been pouring that out upon my feet and caring for them. And in this, Jesus says, you need to realize that those who are forgiven most love most, and those who are forgiven less or are not in touch with it and their need, they are the ones who love least. As John Ortberg wrote, there is a great sin defining this room, but it is not the sin Simon thinks. It is the sin of lips that don't kiss, knees that won't bend, eyes that will not weep, hands that will not serve, perfume that will not leave the jar. It is the sin of a heart that will not break, a life that will not change, a soul that will not love. When I think of these two and Jesus in that room, it's really easy for me to want to kind of judge this religious leader and all their self-righteousness and to kind of champion this woman, how much better she is than him. But when I see this scene, I realize that what Jesus is really presenting is not something that I should be so quick to say I have the right reaction to as well. For Jesus is saying that he's sitting among a room of sinners, that she is the one who has the right grasp of it, and no others appear to, or certainly Simon doesn't. And I have to ask myself, when I hear God want me to grasp the depth of my sin, that I am a sinner, what is my own reaction? Like, how do I really respond to that? Do I really find myself with a deep, deep sense of what that means? Or do I kind of pass across like, yes, I accept that in some technical way? And I think it's easy for us to say, yes, we're kind of in this class. Yes, I know that I've heard it many times. We're all sinners. I've kind of agreed to that. Some kind of intellectual assent to the truth that I am a sinner, but not a deep sense of what that really means and what it really costs. And so I think that part of understanding our need for God is to know this, that our need is not simply technical, but it's relational, deeply relational and personal. I'm certain that this religious leader, Simon, would have understood that he was technically a sinner because he, as a religious leader, was well versed in the scriptures. He understood the story. He understood that all have gone astray. He understood that all needed to make atonement for their sins. So he certainly is one who identifies in some form or fashion that, yes, I technically belong to this category of sinner. And many of us might say, yeah, I technically do, but it's challenging to think about this because I may not realize the degree of that. I start to think, yeah, I know if I ponder it long enough, I bet you there's some rules I broke. No, it's not merely a rule or two that I broke. It's not merely where I slipped up and got a little angry. It's not merely where I focused on something I shouldn't have. It's far more than that. Scriptures say that we've all gone astray, that we are all defiant against God. Apart from the working of God, we have lived in utter defiance, declaring that God is one we wish was out of our lives. We want to take the goods and get rid of the giver. That is at the core of our nature. There is still that which, if we're honest, there's still that bit of that nature that we know that apart from God's heart working in me, part of his spirit working in me, I am deeply defiant. And that there is a nature in me that is far darker and apart from God could be in deep darkness. And it's that we have to come to because what we find is if we're not really deeply honest with ourselves, what we are is merely imposters. We're merely saying, I'm going to live out my life, my facade, and hope that I can find God there, but God can never find the facade because it doesn't exist. We're not being deeply honest with our true nature, the nature that we have apart from God. As Brennan Manning, the great writer, wrote, he said, at Sunday worship, as in every dimension of our existence, many of us pretend to believe we are sinners. Consequently, all we can do is pretend we have been forgiven. As a result, our whole spiritual life is pseudo-repentance and pseudo-bliss. The truth is, God can't forgive and bless who we pretend to be. God can't bless and pretend who we are. I was recalling in this, as I'm engaging this encounter, a moment that I've never forgotten. It's a moment in which I remember I was, as a very young adult, and was actually serving in some youth ministry, and a friend called and said, hey, can we get together? I'd like to stop by. So they stopped by, living at my parents' home at the time, and we sat down, and she began to just say, I've heard this. I don't know if it's true, and you don't need to kind of tell me, and she began to share what she had heard, and it was something that was a reflection of my own real violation of God's boundaries. And it was something that was a moment in which I never felt so utterly exposed. And now, in truth, I felt safe because of her and her nature. But I remember walking into the house, and I remember exactly where I was sitting. I remember sitting on that couch. And in that moment, I felt like I, for the first time, was utterly lost. Like I lost everything. But it wasn't losing some position. It wasn't about her. It's the fact that I thought I now lose God because I am now utterly exposed, not only before God, but before myself. I realized that everything that I thought that I could kind of hide or kind of maneuver in life was now kind of out into the fullness of light. And it was the moment I will never, ever forget. Because as I sat there thinking, this is where I lose God, I suddenly found that as I began to just be in this raw state and just saying to God, I recognize now the reality of my sin and the consequences, that I found myself looking back in a moment of maybe the greatest agreement I ever had with God. Like I've somehow tried to say this doesn't matter, but I see now how much it does and how right you are. And now I'm just faced with the utter consequences. And there I felt the presence of God, his the Spirit just moving in my deep mourning, my own confession. And there I realized that I had not lost God. It was I that had become lost, but in that moment, in a sense, was found because I was facing my truest self. And then as I felt God's Spirit in that, I realized that God meets me there. And that anything I'd ever believed about grace was now real. I believed in grace, but now I'm in the presence of grace, the very place that we have to find ourselves. That's not the last moment I have felt it, but it's maybe the most profound and the most defining. And in that moment, I encountered that grace, and I realized that in that pain, there was also the greatest pleasure I've ever known. And that leads me to note this, that we see that there is something uncomfortable in the very process of finding comfort. There is something uncomfortable in the very process of finding comfort, of finding ourselves before God in all the rawness of who we are. We might ask ourselves, in the scene with Jesus and this woman and this religious leader, who was really in a state of comfort? The religious leader was kind of like, he had the upper hand. He's kind of got everything worked out. He's fairly comfortable. He's the host. He's the one people look to. He's in a relative state of comfort and appearing good socially. The woman, on the other hand, had just walked in and had to reveal herself before people. At some point, they looked up and they said, "Oh my, it's her." And I'm sure that they all looked upon her, and she probably wanted to avoid all of them, but she chose to go past that. She chose to express herself in ways that I'm sure was, at one sense, drawing attention she didn't want, and everybody would have been, in a sense, at a great moment to judge her. But she chose to be exposed. She chose that discomfort, for that is often the way in which we come. And we have to realize, I believe, that as we come to God, that is always a part of the process of coming out of our facades and our humanity. We can say it this way: we must realize that our love for God comes not by looking for happiness, but rather for peace. They are two different things. So much of our life is focused on happiness, but happiness is really just a moment of elation, a moment of reduced anxiety, for the moment. And that is not a bad thing, to have moments of happiness and we kind of feel ourselves lifted, but that is only for a moment. It is not reaching the deepest places. That we have to go for, and that is that place of peace, where we can stand for who we are and find that God meets us there. That is a very different thing. As C.S. Lewis says, I don't go to religion to make me happy. I always knew that a bottle of port would do that. If you want a religion to make you feel really comfortable, I certainly don't recommend Christianity. He's spot on. He's spot on. If all we're looking for is, I just want to find some kind of pseudo peace, or just some kind of detachment, or some kind of sense of mild transcendence on my terms, that is not what it means to come to Jesus, because Jesus is the face of grace. And when you come to grace, you have to face yourself. We have to go through that process. And so we have to ask ourselves, is there maybe a good discomfort? That is what is at hand for this woman. That is what is at hand for us. We spend so much of our lives in so many forms and fashions of self-medicating our souls. But there is something about getting outside of merely medicating our own sense of self-rejection and our own sense of realizing that we are not entirely good and trying to be better and imagining it and trying to just feel it. When we come to terms with it, as Brennan Manning describes, he says, honesty brings an end to pretense through a candid acknowledgement of our fragile humanity. It was always unpleasant and usually painful, and that is why I am not very good at it, he says. But to stand in the truth before God and one another has a unique reward. It is the reward which a sense of reality always brings. I know something extremely precious. I am in touch with myself as I am. That is the reward. That is the peace. To get to the place where we're in touch with ourselves for who we really are, and there met by God. And this is why in the 12-step program that some are familiar with, the center of it, what is deemed to be the most powerful is coming to that place of surrender, where one surrenders themselves to that higher power, surrendering themselves, but knowing that that is perhaps the hardest thing to do, to truly say that I am not God, God is God, and come to terms with one's own limitations of their own power to fix themselves, their power to fully make of themselves what they want to be, that they must rely on that which is outside of themselves. That is the power. We can say this surrender is where pain and peace meet, when we finally allow our true selves to be exposed in the presence of God and depend upon his grace and power. That is what it means to come and to bring our true need before God and there find what we've deemed to have never known, which is grace, the power of grace. And finally, as we see in this woman, I want to bring us home to this truth, that our need to turn around and be forgiven is not the end. It is ultimately our need to come home. It's ultimately a coming home to who we really are. To put it this way, our need is not the despair of merely being sinners who are lost, but the joy of sinners who are found. She, in that moment, she was found. She was found. She had been lost her whole life, but in coming into that moment, there she is no longer merely a sinner who is lost, but she is one who is now found for who she really was. It's interesting that the religious leader refers to her as just a sinner. But Luke, no, he has stepped back, and in the reality of Jesus, he says, she is a woman who sinned. She is first a woman, a person, like anybody else, who has allowed her own wounds to carry her to do things that are degrading to her. But at her core, she was doing a lot more than merely physically letting her hair down. She was letting herself be free, free to not worry what anybody else thought. But that was certainly not something you should do in public. She didn't care. She's found. Like, this is it. Like, this is who this person is to me. And it means more than anything else. And that is the moment that Jesus is inviting us to, where you realize again, this is worth everything. To know that I can be forgiven at the level of what forgiveness means, to know that a cost so great, a love so great can meet me, is what I need most deeply. And it's what God has come to do for me. I can hardly take it in, but it matters more than anything. As St. Augustine once said, my heart is restless until I find my rest in thee. That is what she comes to. That is what we are invited to in this season. Now, are we being told that we need to just come out and behave as this woman did and just kind of imitate her? Not in terms of exactly how she expressed herself. No, not at all, because this is too personal to merely be something we imitate. Oh, I need to go and carry on with this kind of behavior and per se. No, it's too personal. It's too personal for mere imitation. But we are invited to come to that place that she came to, that place in which she realizes that grace is everything. I'll do anything for grace. And that God actually is inviting me to the reality of that grace. If I will bring the reality of my need, I will be there able to experience the reality of grace. And that I live in that love. And there is nothing else. It is my first love. And out of that first love, everything else flows in life. But I have to come back to that first love. This is worth giving my whole life to. And this Lenten season is inviting us to seek that face of grace. And each week we are going to have some simple practice that I invite you to join me in carrying on through this season. And they are all there. Each week we're defining that and kind of shaping that which can serve our forming our love for God. And this week it is simply this: to take on and finish and focus on this statement: I need God because. I need God because. And the invitation is to set apart some times throughout the week to come to that statement, enough time to really be able to kind of set your mind and your focus and your heart apart, not merely to kind of run through something quickly, but to sit with that question and begin to respond to it. You might do so on a journal, because there's nothing like writing. You might do it on a device. But to create some space where you simply begin to respond to and write out, I need God because. And to continue that through a few points throughout the week, and to help form in you where you begin to realize, one, how God is distinct, and also how God is connected, and what it means to come to grace, and the needs that you have, and the condition you find yourself in. And so we'll make this possible on the app. And if you haven't downloaded the app, this would be the time to do so. This would be the time to do so that you can have a very simple means to that and some simple instructions. But that is the essence of that. And I want to invite us to bring our hearts into worship as we continue in this time by hearing the words of King David, whose words of hunger for God speak so well into this time of realizing our need and realizing how powerful that need can be if we get in touch with where we stand and who we are and who God is. In Psalm 63, David writes these words: "O God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you." Even those words are words that invite me, because oftentimes it's not an earnestness. It's a need, perhaps. It's a casualness. It's an obligation. It's a duty. But he says, I earnestly search for you. My soul thirsts for you. My whole body longs for you in this parched and weary land where there is no water. I have seen you in your sanctuary and gazed upon your power and glory. Your unfailing love is better than life itself. I can think of nothing that I need to find myself being able to say to myself and grasping that his unfailing love is greater than life itself. How I praise you. I will praise you as long as I live, lifting up my hands to you in prayer. You satisfy me more than the richest feast. I will praise you with songs of joy. What an invitation to thirst for God like one who's parched and has no water by which to survive, and realizes he is that. And there is no place that our soul will really find home and satisfaction apart from his love. Let's pray.